Okay, good morning and thank you everyone for joining the first of our breakfast briefings as part of H&F Climate Carnival. And this morning's session is on homes, buildings and energy. So just before we get started, why are we here? So next week, many of us will have heard in the news that the UK is hosting the UN Climate Change Conference, which is called COP26. And so what we're doing locally is we're hosting this climate carnival. So this is a week-long program of events. We have 58 events happening across the borough this week. And this is all about raising awareness of the climate emergency and getting involved in local action. So we know that these discussions that are happening in Glasgow are incredibly important and that we do need international and national leadership in this. But this is also, we know that local and getting involved in things in our community is where we can really take action and where we can have the most power to make a difference. So please do have a look at our whole program of activities on the website as well. So please also have a look at our recently published climate and ecology strategy. And this sets out our route to net zero emissions by 2030. So what do we need to do to get there? First of all, we need to eliminate the carbon emissions from our homes, buildings and energy. And as you'll learn today, this is the biggest source of carbon emissions across our borough. The second thing that we need to do is look at how we move around. So moving away from petrol and diesel vehicles to things like active travel, walking and cycling, shared electric vehicles and public transport. And then we also need to look at the things that we buy and the things that we use. So there's carbon emissions hidden in the supply chains of everything we use, from our electronics to our clothes to our furniture. So please do join the next 2 mornings if you're interested in transport and things we use on Tuesday and Wednesday to learn more about those areas as well. And in responding to the climate emergency, we also need to protect people and nature. So one of those things is about ecology and making more space for nature within our borough. And then finally, we also need to adapt to climate change. So the local impacts of climate change, which are hotter summers and risks of overheating and risks of flooding. We need to prepare for those so that we can look after and protect people and planet. And then at the bottom there, these are our different enablers. So we're looking at engagement and influence, which is how we can galvanize residents, visitors and organizations and help everyone across the borough to act. We also need to look at how we make every decision and our finances support net zero. And then finally, also grasp some of the opportunities from the green economy. So if you're interested in that, please do join us on Thursday morning at Sands End Community Centre to look at the role of organisations in reaching net zero as well. So what are we going to be covering today? Shortly, I'll be handing over to colleagues in our climate unit to give you a bit of an introduction to buildings and net zero, and then talk about what the council is doing. And so please do use the chat for Q&A throughout the session. And then we will be going through those questions, as I said, in chronological order and following up with any questions we can't answer there. Okay, so I'm now just going to go to my colleague, Tim, and hand over, and he will give you an introduction to buildings and net zero. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Emily. Can you hear me okay? Fantastic. And good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for attending today. So yes, as Emily said, this session is on kind of the first part of our climate strategy, so the challenge of getting our buildings to net zero. And we have this super ambitious target in the borough of getting all of the borough to net zero carbon by 2030. And I think it's fair to say that buildings are the biggest part of that challenge, because buildings, if you look at our climate strategy and you look at our kind of baseline of what we're emitting now in our region, in our area, in our borough, buildings are around about 3/4 of our total emissions. So it's the biggest single challenge we've got. So it's really, really important. Next slide, please, Emily. So what do we mean? Some of you will probably have heard one of us describe this before, but I thought it'd just be helpful just to spend 30 seconds talking through what net zero is, and what we mean by net zero. And it really is what the world's climate scientists are completely clear that we all need to achieve all around the world, and especially in richer countries like the UK, sometime this century, ideally really by mid-century, to avoid the worst effects of climate change. And whilst you'll notice the term net zero, so it implies that we're not reducing our emissions completely to zero, because there is some potential to things like carbon, people call them carbon negative technologies, where, for instance, if you burn wood to make energy and then lock up the carbon you produce as a result of that, you can actually suck a small amount of carbon out of the atmosphere. For us to get to net zero, the main thing we need to do is reduce the amount of carbon we're emitting and other greenhouse gases we're emitting enormously, by at least 80% by where we are now, because otherwise there's no way that the kind of carbon offsetting element will be able to soak up the difference. So for buildings, when kind of talking about net zero in relation to buildings, the most commonly used definition globally comes from something called the World Green Building Council, and they've got a branch in the UK as well, and that's what most people in the UK tend to follow. And that's that quote there: a highly energy efficient building with all remaining energy from on-site and or off-site renewable sources. So really for buildings, what we're primarily looking at is the energy that buildings use to be heated, to be lit, from things like all the appliances in the buildings, the kind of the emissions from using the buildings day to day. And we want to try and get those emissions down to zero by 2030. So it's no small challenge. And that highly energy efficient building bit is important. So we don't want our buildings to use any more energy than they need to do their jobs. Clearly, we want our buildings to be warm and comfortable and service schools and service hospitals and service homes and offices. But we don't want to waste energy in the process of doing that. So we don't want things like leaky walls, leaky roofs, things left on when they're not being used. We want to try and stop all of that from happening. The second bullet point there, this is something that is at a much earlier stage. We also need to consider the emissions created when buildings are constructed, refurbished and demolished. And the reason I put that there is because there's the construction industry, the construction sector, has really quite a high carbon footprint, and that's whilst the kind of idea of a net zero target doesn't usually include those construction emissions at the moment, it's something we definitely want to consider as well. Next slide, please, Emily. So when we're talking about highly energy efficient building that gets all of its energy from renewable sources, what do we mean, and what are the main things we need to do to make that happen? And really, I think it falls into these three categories I put on this slide here. So reduce demand, we need to make the building as efficient as we possibly can. And that challenge in turn breaks down into two main components, which is new builds. And we want our new buildings to be net zero carbon as they are built. We don't want to have to come back to them in 10 years' time and do expensive work on them to make them net zero carbon. And then we want our existing buildings, that's the net zero carbon building retrofits bit there. We want our existing buildings to be as near to net zero carbon as we can get them as well. You'll often hear people talk about fabric first in a building. That basically just means making the walls and the roof and the windows and the doors properly insulated, and reducing uncontrolled ventilation and replacing it with controlled ventilation, heat recovery ventilation instead. And that final point, plug load there, what I mean by that is just a term for all the stuff that is plugged into the walls in a building as well. We need to remember that and take that into account as well, because that also all uses energy. So things like fridges and dishwashers and televisions and the computer that I'm giving this presentation on, we want all of that to be as efficient as we can make it as well. And then once we have made our buildings as efficient as we can, that's really kind of the first step. We want to get the remaining energy from renewable sources. So on-site renewables, renewable energy that's actually kind of integrated within the building is best if you can do it. And for us in Hammersmith and Fulham, that will primarily mean solar energy, and I'm running a session on that at 2 o'clock this afternoon for anyone who's interested in that. And it will also probably mean, to a great extent, heat pumps as well, which are a form of renewable energy, because while they do use some electricity, they pump in heat, free heat from outside the building into the building. But we will also need to make use of off-site renewables. We'll need to buy in renewables from the grid as well, because we are a very densely built up borough and we don't have huge amounts of space to put in lots of renewable energy. And then that last point, you will hear quite a bit at the moment from the UK government about decarbonising heat. And the main reason for that is because at the moment, most buildings in the UK and most buildings in the borough rely on heat, rely on gas. Natural gas for heat. Natural gas is a fossil fuel, so we really want to get rid of that and replace it with electricity, which again mainly means heat pumps. And then the third point is just to measure and monitor how our buildings are performing. And there's a whole industry around this, but if you design a building to be net zero carbon and then you don't measure what that building is doing, there's quite a high chance that building is not performing as designed and as intended. Next slide, please, Emily. So net zero embodied carbon, I'm not going to say too much about this, but I wanted to mention it because I think that whilst most local authorities are not really thinking about this at the moment and not doing much about this, I'm quite keen, and I think that the climate team is keen that Hammersmith and Fulham is a leader on this and starts to think about how to reduce this as well. So this is when we are doing things like retrofitting our buildings and when we are putting in place new buildings, thinking about the materials we make those buildings from and where those materials are coming from. That picture is of a cement kiln, and it's to make the point that cement and concrete is a really high carbon, very polluting material. It's a really useful material because you can form it into any shape you want. It's super strong, it's super relatively cheap, but it is very environmentally damaging. So can we substitute in some buildings concrete for things like timber, which is a much better environmental option? Can we use recycled steel in place of virgin steel, things like that? So we need to be thinking about those sorts of things as well as emissions from the construction side, emissions from constructing the building itself, which are also bad for urban air quality too, which is an important thing that important factor we're trying to deal with in the borough. Next slide, please, Emily. I'm very nearly there. I just wanted to put this up really to make the point that we have a particular challenge in Hammersmith and Fulham. I think if you're Stevenage or Milton Keynes, you have a much easier challenge because you have a lot more relatively modern buildings, and you are less. People talk about building retrofit, kind of adapting buildings, existing buildings to climate change, as sometimes being space constrained and appearance constrained. And in Hammersmith and Fulham, we are both space constrained and appearance constrained. We have lots of heritage, period, solid brick wall buildings, such as those I put on the image here. And those buildings are relatively difficult to retrofit. Not impossible. One of our residents, Brian Thresh, is opening up his house, his early Edwardian, early 20th century period house today between 10 and 4 p.m. To show what can be done and how you can retrofit a period house to be net zero carbon, but it is harder, therefore we have a bigger challenge in this borough than many other boroughs do. Another big opportunity that we do have is because we are a dense borough, we can put in place hopefully a lot of heat networks as well, and we're currently working with the London Energy Accelerator to look at the opportunities for clean ground source heat pump networks in the borough as well, which is something that's harder to do if you're in a less dense area. Next slide, please, Emily. And I just wanted, this is just kind of to advertise that I was talking about highly energy efficient buildings, and then I was talking about those buildings being powered by renewable electricity, and then I said solar energy is probably in Hammersmith and Fulham the best kind of renewable energy we can use. And to try and incentivize more householders, more residents to put in place renewable energy, we've waived the charge for our duty planner advice service for solar energy for at least the next year. So please do take advantage of that and look into that if you are thinking of putting solar energy onto your house. And as I said, I'm running a session at 2 p.m. if you want to find out more about that and more about the opportunities for solar energy, then do please come along to that. So I'm now going to hand over to Rob and Jess to talk a bit more about some of the specific projects that we are doing to get buildings to net zero in the borough. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tim. So hi, everyone. My name is Rob Kyle. I'm a project manager in the Climate and Ecological Emergency team. And as Tim said, I'm here to talk about what we're doing as a council in the borough to decarbonise our buildings. Next slide, please, Emily. So first of all, excuse the pun, but we are getting our own house in order, which is obviously incredibly important. And one of the first things that we're doing is working with the Greater London Authority on a programme called Retrofit Accelerator Workplaces, where we explore different buildings to group together to retrofit at scale and reduce the price of retrofitting some of our corporate buildings. And that's a programme that will go on for a number of years. We're sourcing renewable energy. We already buy 100% green electricity for our corporate buildings. But what we'd like to do is also go direct to source, so invest in solar panel farms and wind farms. We're upgrading the civic campus hugely, which I'll come on to talk about a bit more in another slide. And we're also using as many government grants as possible to decarbonise our buildings. There are a lot of government grants at the moment that we're looking at and looking to utilise and get projects in place to take advantage of those government grants. And as Tim mentioned, we're looking to lead by example on embodied carbon. We do, as part of our climate strategy, have a goal to look at a number of projects to understand the embodied carbon of the materials that we use to upgrade some of our buildings, to retrofit them and get them to net zero. And then onto our social housing. So if you could change the next slide, please. Thanks. So we have a huge amount of social housing in the borough, obviously. We have about 17,000 social houses. And it's vitally important that we decarbonise as many of those as possible. And at the moment, we're working on a retrofit strategy to look at how we can do this at scale. But one of the more interesting projects that we're doing at the moment is called Energy Sprung, which is a whole house retrofit approach. And we're doing that on about 28 houses in the West Kensington estate. And you can see a picture of it there on the right-hand side. So you've got a before and after of the Energy Sprung project. And you can see that the house on the right-hand side has been upgraded using insulation. They'll have air source heat pumps, which Tim referred to earlier. There'll be solar panels. There'll be battery storage to store the renewable energy that the solar panels create. So what this will do, it will reduce the emissions of the properties up to 80%. It will make them more healthier and more comfortable for our residents to live in. Now, obviously, we've got a lot of houses, but this project is incredibly important as a strategic project. It's going to develop our knowledge on retrofit. It's going to help drive down the price of retrofit. And it's really going to help us develop partnerships with our new suppliers, understanding how they work, working together to develop new technologies, to develop new ways of making retrofit easier and cheaper. Next slide, please, Emily. And as I mentioned, the civic campus, so that's being rebuilt at the moment or upgraded at the moment. And there'll be a BREEAM standard, which is a sustainability standard of very good, which will be a huge achievement for a listed building. There's going to be solar panels, energy efficient lighting, rainwater harvesting, solar shading, where we protect the building from the sun, as we know the climate's going to get hotter in the future. And there'll also be an advanced building management system. And all of these will make the building much more energy efficient. And really the jewel in the crown of this project is the ground source heat pump. Again, Tim referred to these earlier, where we source heat from the ground to heat the building. And drilling started last week to just understand whether that will be possible. We do think it will be, but they obviously need to do some tests. But if and when that gets installed, that'll be an incredibly innovative heating system in London. And then obviously we have influence within the wider borough. So we're working with private housing to help people understand what they can do to take advantage of current government grants that are available. But obviously there's also behaviour change that can have a huge impact on the amount of energy that they're using in their homes. We're also working with businesses and commercial buildings to do the same thing, and currently looking at developing a climate alliance where we bring businesses together to work together to help them understand the different things that they can do to decarbonize their buildings, but also to help the people that are working in those buildings use less energy. Again, another thing that Tim mentioned was the clean heat networks. As a council, we have a huge amount of influence to ensure that these are developed in the borough, and we use essentially piping to distribute energy that's not being used, or heat that's not being used efficiently, from larger buildings to other buildings in the borough. And I know that we're working with the Greater London Authority to do some heat master planning at the moment to understand where we can most effectively use those. And finally, we're working to develop planning frameworks with the planning team for new net zero carbon buildings, developing new infrastructure, and looking at major refurbishments. Thank you very much for listening. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Jess, who's going to talk about minimum energy efficiency standards.
Thanks, Rob. Hi, everyone. My name is Jess Chai. I'm the graduate officer in the climate unit. And finally, I just want to emphasize that we at the council can't control everything in the wider borough, but we can influence a large proportion of emissions, including those from the private sector through levers such as the minimum energy efficiency standards. And this is something that will be enforced by the council, enforced by the council in the borough. So these standards require landlords both in the domestic and non-domestic sector to upgrade their properties to at least an EPC E rating. So EPC is Energy Performance Certificate, and over time these regulations will tighten to EPC C for domestic and EPC B for non-domestic by 2030, which will encourage landlords to retrofit their properties and thus tackling energy efficiency, fuel poverty, and also carbon emissions. So if you're a tenant or landlord and you want to know more, we do have an event on Thursday at lunchtime specifically about these regulations. So please do visit our website to sign up if you're interested. Next slide, please, Emily. So now I just want to talk about some of the support out there that can help you get started on your own net zero journey. So first up, we have the Green Homes Grant, Local Authority Delivery Scheme, which is completely different to the voucher scheme. This is a government scheme which has allocated Hammersmith and Fulham Council some funding to give away to eligible households for retrofit works. So currently we're accepting residents who have a household annual income of less than 30,000, and additionally you can have up to £20,000 in housing benefits. Along with the eligibility criteria, you must also be living in a property that is rated EPC D or below. So the amount of funding you receive is completely dependent on your tenure. If you own your home, you can receive up to £10,000 and have 100% of the measures funded. Whereas if you're a tenant, you can receive up to £5,000 in grant funding and only 2/3 of the measures funded, with the remaining 1/3 contributed by the landlord. So just to emphasize, this is all grant funding, which means that you do not need to pay this money back. The installers have already been contracted on your behalf, and so everything is ready to go. Next slide, please, Emily. Thank you. So here are just some of the measures that are available. There are a whole range, so these are only a few, and we've got different types of insulation. You can also upgrade your single glazing to double glazing, and there are other smaller measures too, like the draft proofing and the low energy lighting. Next slide, please. So another scheme we have at the moment is the Energy Company Obligation, or ECO for short. This is another government scheme distributed by energy suppliers though, and is dedicated to support customers to lower their energy bills and their carbon footprint through measures such as insulation again, first-time central heating, upgrading your heating controls, or boiler repairs. So again, with the Green Homes Grant, there's the eligibility criteria, which is dependent on tenure. Hammersmith and Fulham Council have also launched another pathway within ECO called Flexible Eligibility, which is only available for private home owners, which expands upon the existing criteria, meaning more households get access to this funding. And I can show you where you can find all this information on the next slide, please. So if you visit our energy initiatives page on our website, you can see here all the information for ECO, and there's the flexible eligibility with the statement of intent link there that you can go to find out more if you're eligible. And then if you are, there's a list of installers right there that you can contact and get a free survey. We've also got information on the Green Homes Grant there. Again, all the eligibility criteria and the funding. And then at the bottom, we've got information about Green Doctors, which is our free energy efficiency advice service. So next slide, please. And then finally, we have the domestic renewable heat incentive, which provides financial support to the owners of microgeneration technologies of the property for about 7 years. So this includes like biomass boilers, solar water heating, and certain heat pumps. I advise you to go check the Ofgem website to see if the heating system that you are considering to install is eligible. Unfortunately, this scheme does not include new builds. So yeah, I would advise you check out the website. When you come to receive the payments, these are dependent on the amount of energy generated by your heating system. And if you would like to take advantage of this, I suggest getting on it right now, because the scheme is due to close on the 31st of March next year. Next slide, please. So if you would like to apply for any of these grants or schemes, so for the Green Homes Grant, please call Green Doctors, which is the Energy Efficiency Advice Service. And for Eco, please go on our website. And again, for the Renewable Heat Incentive, please check out Ofgem. Thanks, and I'll now hand over to Emily to do the Q&A.
Fab, thank you very much, Tim, Rob, and Jess, for all of your presentations so far. We've now got time for Q&A, and I'm going to pause the recording.
Thanks for that, everyone. So finally, just before we wrap up, what is on today? If you have a look at the programme, which is on lbhf.gov.uk/climate-carnival, you can have a look at some of the events that are happening today. We've usually got a couple of webinars in the afternoon and lots of events happening out and about all over the borough. So please do have a look. We've got over 50 things happening this week. So please do check out the programme and get involved if you have time later today. And finally, just before we wrap up, please do sign up to our newsletter. So this is a monthly newsletter all about climate action taking place across the borough. We talk about what we're doing as a council, things that are happening in the community, things you can get involved in, as well as what we're reading and sharing. So if you head to the climate pages on our website, you can sign up for Climate Connects. And finally, that's us for this morning. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming along, to all of our speakers for presenting, and for everyone's questions and comments. That's our generic email address there that comes through to me. So look forward to speaking with you there, and our web address as well. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the week.